The sound of rushing water used to be peaceful until it started coming from my home. My name is David, and I live in a quiet cul-de-sac in a neighborhood that looks like a postcard on the outside but hides a dark and muddy secret on the inside. It all started after a massive storm hit our county. Most of the houses were fine because they were built on high ground, but my property sits at the bottom of a gentle slope. That slope belongs to the Green Valley Homeowners Association common area. One morning I woke up to find my backyard looking like a swamp. I initially thought it was just bad luck or a fluke of nature. I spent the weekend digging small trenches and trying to save my prize-winning rose bushes, but the water just kept coming. I noticed something strange while I was out there in my rubber boots. The water was not just falling from the sky or running off the grass naturally. It was gushing out of a hidden drainage pipe that the HOA had installed right behind my fence line. They were literally using my private property as a drainage basin for the entire neighborhood street. I decided to handle it like a professional. I call the HOA president a man named Richard, who thinks he owns the sun and the moon just because he wears a cheap suit to board meetings. I explained the situation calmly and told him that the new pipe was flooding my basement and destroying my landscaping. Richard did not even let me finish. He laughed into the phone and told me that the common area drainage was vital for the safety of the neighborhood. He said that my yard was the natural path for runoff and that I should have checked the topography before buying the house. He told me to stop complaining and hung up the phone. I was stunned. I looked at the water rising against my foundation, and I felt a heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the humidity. I sent a formal letter the next day via certified mail. I included photos of the pipe and the damage to my property. A week later, I received a response, but it was not an apology. It was a fine for $500 for unapproved landscaping changes because I had dug those small trenches to try and save my garden. They were not just ignoring the problem, they were punishing me for trying to fix the mess they created. I stood in my kitchen watching the rain start to fall again. The water began to pour out of that hidden pipe like a fire hose. It was clear that Richard and the board thought I was just another pushover homeowner who would pay the fine and shut up. They had no idea that I spent 15 years as a civil engineer specializing in fluid dynamics. They wanted to play games with water and gravity. I knew those two things better than I knew my own name. I sat down at my drafting table and pulled out the original plat maps of the neighborhood. I saw exactly what they had done. They had bypassed the city storm drain system to save the HOA money on maintenance fees and diverted it all into my lot. It was illegal, and it was arrogant. I did not get angry this time. I got a pencil and started calculating flow rates. If they wanted to dump their problems on me, they were about to learn that water always finds a way back to the source. The plan was forming in my mind, and it was going to be expensive for them, but perfectly legal for me. I spent the next 3 days in my garage looking over local building codes and drainage laws. I found the loophole I needed. I did not need their permission to install a decorative retaining wall and a French drain system on my own land as long as it met specific height requirements. I called a contractor friend of mine and told him I needed the heaviest equipment he had and 20 tons of non-porous clay soil. He asked me what I was planning, and I just told him I was doing some heavy-duty gardening. The rain was coming down harder now, and the HOA board was having their monthly meeting in the center of the neighborhood at the community clubhouse. I could see their expensive cars parked in the lot through the mist. They were sitting in there sipping coffee and talking about paint colors while my basement was inches away from being ruined. I looked at my blueprints one last time. It was time to stop the flood and start the lesson. The heavy machinery arrived at dawn on a Tuesday. The sound of the diesel engines echoed through the quiet streets, waking up the very neighbors who had been benefiting from my yard being a swamp. My contractor friend Leo hopped out of the cab of a massive excavator and looked at the muddy mess behind my house. He asked if I was sure about the legal side of this, and I handed him a folder full of permits and signed documents from the city planning office. I had spent the last 48 hours getting every single stamp of approval I needed. The HOA rule said I could not change the appearance of my front yard without permission, but the backyard rules were much more vague, especially regarding flood prevention and soil stabilization. Leo started the work. We were not just digging a hole. We were building a fortress. The goal was simple but devastating. We were going to install a high-density polyethylene barrier 6 feet deep along the entire back property line. On top of that, we were building a tiered retaining wall made of solid concrete blocks disguised with stone veneer. But the secret was the grade. We were raising the elevation of my back boundary by 3 feet using compacted clay that water cannot penetrate. As the sun climbed higher, the HOA board members started to notice. I saw Richard walking down the sidewalk in his jogging outfit. He stopped in my driveway, and his face turned a bright shade of red. He started screaming about how I did not have architectural committee approval for a wall. I stepped off my porch holding my permit folder and a cup of coffee. I told him that according to Section 4 of the bylaws, emergency repairs for structural integrity do not require a waiting period if a permit is issued by the county. I showed him the permit for a decorative erosion control feature. He tried to tell me to stop the work immediately, but I pointed to the police officer sitting in a cruiser down the street. I had hired an off-duty cop for security because I knew Richard would try to interfere. For the next 8 hours, the dirt flew. We were effectively turning my property into an island. By the time the sun went down, my backyard was no longer a basin. It was a plateau. The drainage pipe from the HOA common area was now staring directly into a wall of solid clay and concrete. There was nowhere for the water to go except back into the HOA land. That night, a massive thunderstorm rolled in. It was the kind of storm that usually sent me running for the sump pump in the basement. I stood on my back porch with a flashlight. I watched as the water began to gush out of the HOA pipe. It hit my new wall and immediately began to pool on the HOA side of the fence. Because I had raised the elevation, the water started backing up into the pipe system. Within an hour, the entire common area behind my house was a lake. But it did not stop there. Because the HOA had skimped on the original drainage design, the backup started affecting the storm drains on the main street. I went to bed and slept better than I had in months. The sound of the rain was like music because I knew my basement was bone dry. At 4 in the morning, I was woken up by a frantic pounding on my front door. I looked at my security camera and saw Richard and 3 other board members. They were soaked to the bone and looking panicked. I opened the window upstairs and asked if they needed a life raft. Richard was pointing toward the street. The water had backed up so much that the entrance to the neighborhood was flooded, and 2 of the board members had water creeping into their own garages. They demanded that I tear down the wall immediately. I told them that the wall was a permanent structure approved by the city and that I would be happy to discuss it at the next board meeting in 3 weeks. I shut the window and went back to sleep. The next morning, the neighborhood looked like a disaster zone. The beautiful common area with its manicured grass and expensive benches was under 2 feet of murky water. The street was impassable for small cars, and the HOA office, which was located in a low-lying building near the entrance, had 6 inches of water in the lobby. The irony was thick enough to swim in. For years they had saved money by dumping this water on me, and now that I had simply claimed my right to a dry yard, their entire system had collapsed. I walked out to my mailbox dressed in a clean suit. A group of neighbors had gathered near the flooding. Some were angry at me, but many more were starting to realize the truth. They saw the city inspectors walking around with clipboards. I had called the municipal drainage department and filed a formal complaint about the HOA illegal pipe. When the city inspector reached my property, he looked at my wall and then looked at the flooded common area. He checked my permits and nodded. He told me that my wall was perfectly legal and that the HOA was in massive violation of the Clean Water Act and local building codes. He explained that by diverting street runoff into a private residential lot without a formal easement, the HOA had committed a serious offense. Richard tried to intervene again, telling the inspector that I had caused the flooding by blocking the natural flow. The inspector looked at Richard like he was an idiot. He told Richard that there was nothing natural about a hidden PVC pipe dumping hundreds of gallons a minute onto a neighbor's lawn. The inspector then issued a cease and desist order to the HOA. They were ordered to seal the illegal pipe and install a proper drainage system that connected to the city main. The estimated cost for such a project was over $200,000. The board members looked like they were going to faint. That afternoon, an emergency neighborhood meeting was called in the park. People were screaming. The HOA was going to have to issue a special assessment, which meant every single homeowner would have to pay thousands of dollars to fix the drainage because the board had been negligent. I stood at the back of the crowd and watched as the neighbors turned on Richard. They asked him why he had ignored my letters. They asked why he had fined me for trying to protect my home. Richard tried to blame me, but I stepped forward and held up my phone. I played the recording of our first phone call where he laughed at me and told me to stop complaining. The crowd went silent as his voice echoed through the park telling me that the water was my problem now. The shift in the air was palpable. It was no longer about a wall or a pipe. It was about the abuse of power. The neighbors realized that if Richard could do this to me, he could do it to any of them. A motion was made on the spot to remove the entire board of directors. Richard was shouting about bylaws and procedures, but no one was listening. They were tired of the bullying and they were tired of the flooding. The fallout was swift and total. Within a week, Richard and his cronies were forced to resign. A new interim board was formed, and they reached out to me immediately. They did not come with fines or threats. They came with an apology. They asked for my professional advice as an engineer on how to fix the neighborhood drainage properly without bankrupting everyone. I agreed to help on one condition. The HOA had to reimburse me for the cost of my retaining wall and the damages to my basement from the previous floods. They also had to wipe my record clean of any previous fines. They agreed within 10 minutes. We spent the next month working with the city to design a state-of-the-art drainage system. It turned out that the original developers had left a massive gap in the infrastructure, and the previous HOA board had tried to hide it with the illegal pipe to keep the property values high and the dues low. It was a short-sighted plan that finally caught up with them. As the construction crews worked to install the new city pipes, I watched from my dry backyard. My wall stayed up as a reminder of the battle. My roses were blooming again, and the grass was lush and green. The neighborhood changed after that. It was no longer a place of strict rules and hidden agendas. People started talking to each other instead of reporting each other for having the wrong shade of curtains. Richard eventually moved out of the neighborhood. I saw him packing his boxes into a U-Haul one Saturday morning. He did not look at my house as he drove away. I think he knew that water always wins in the end, and so does the truth. My story went viral in the local news, and soon other homeowners in different associations were looking at their own drainage and their own boards. I became a bit of a local hero for the little guy. I learned that you do not have to be a victim of a bully even if that bully has a fancy title and a clipboard. You just have to know your rights and be willing to stand your ground. Sometimes you have to build a wall to bring people together. The rain still falls in Green Valley, but it does not cause panic anymore. It just waters the gardens and flows exactly where it is supposed to go. I sit on my porch now whenever a storm rolls in, and I watch the water disappear into the new drains. It is the most beautiful sight in the world. I kept my permits framed in my office as a souvenir. They are a reminder that no matter how much someone tries to flood your life, you can always find a way to redirect the flow. Justice is not always fast, and it is definitely not always dry, but it is always worth the fight.